Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first edition of my new series on character development. Today's, of course, will be at the very beginning of developing a character and delving into what really makes them tick and exploring them throughout a story. And we're going to start with the start itself, which is introductions. And I'm very much so at this moment in my work on my next novel, thinking about character introductions. I already wrote the book actually a few years ago, but it needs a lot of structural work. And I've kind of known that for a time. And so as I'm rewriting it, I'm reorganizing it. I have a lot of, I think, great visuals and good ideas throughout the novel, and the overall plotting and structure I think are pretty strong. But I realize, like, as I go through, it's like, sometimes there's just a character that just appears and they disappear for no reason, or they appear and it's not. I don't know. I think it doesn't give them the justice, or it doesn't do justice to the character the way they're introduced. It's kind of offhand, and you don't realize they're going to be important. And so I've been thinking a lot about character introductions and making sure that I define that particularly well, or define them particularly well early in my stories, so that there is a good channel for them, or a good path for them to start moving towards, so they can change, right? So I think that's probably the first thing I want to highlight, is that the road to deep character development starts with the introduction. It starts with understanding whoever this person is at the present time, because it's not really a novel or a story. I don't think is just about learning a bit about who your characters are. It's not just learning who they are. It's seeing them, seeing whoever that person is make a decision, see them make a choice, see them make a mistake, see them try and either succeed or fail to do something. And so you really have to develop that or define that really early on, I think, in a story. And so, when you think of the place an introduction might, have within a story, obviously it's early. Obviously you want to know right off the bat. But there's a lot of things you'll set up. You'll set up the setting. Where are you located? When? And maybe what the conflict is. But you really have to know who these people are as well, and it's a balancing act. And I'm doing a lot of world building with my current novel, and that's a challenge. I have so much world building to do, because it's set a little bit into the future, and there's a handful of technologies that aren't available today, but to kind of add to the story. But it's primarily a detective novel, very kind of film noir. Think the Maltese Falcon and stuff like that. So I think working on the story, I mean, it's great to kind of use some of those the things from those types of other tales, the type of music, the type of tone or setting, and just pacing that they use. But ultimately, like right now I'm looking at it, and I got chapter 1 done, and I introduced my main character, but I need to introduce more, and I still got to keep this story moving forward. I don't want people to say, okay, now I stop and have to learn about a character. It's like, no, I want the story to keep moving forward, but you also need to know who they are. And again, get a feel for what types of decisions they're going to make. So again, if they're going to evolve, they have to start somewhere. And people talk about journeys, and more often than not, stories take on a sort of journey or quest structure from going from one place to another as they progress. And it's really, more often than not, those places are really just different levels of that person's decision making, visualized as a physical location. But if you can get people to understand and give them an idea of how you think and what types of decisions or what types of reactions you might have or they might have, your character might have to a particular situation, like that's when you have a great, really well developed character. Because when people can see, and they just see a situation arise, and they go, oh, he's going to do this, or he's going to say that, or he's going to do something, terrible. It might be, or he's going to say something inappropriate, or or this or that, or he doesn't like this type of person or this type of request, and so they're going to respond negatively. Whatever it is, if people know how your character is going to react, if they have a very strong feel for that early in the story, it really helps add to the rest of the tale. I think I'll mention more about Stephen King here in a minute, but it's something he's used incredibly well, because with anything horror, when you know what your characters or what a character is going to do, what type of decision they're going to make, then you can make it so that that decision is obviously scary. Oh, this is somebody who's going to walk into the scary room, and they're going to be tough. But you're on the other side of that tale, and that that's not a good idea, or they're going to run and hide in a particular place. They're going to hide in the closet. well, if you set up beforehand that the bad guy's already in the closet, it's like, well, now knowing how your character's going to act gives you suspense for like when they go and hide, because you've already developed that that's a bad idea and you know they're going to make that choice. So that's I think he does a great job of that a lot with a lot of different characters. And and I think that just getting that idea out there, though, like what do they care about early on in the story? What are they thinking about? Where are they? How are they oriented? And oftentimes you can kind of do this with this idea of like, where do they draw the line in the sand? Like what's that line where they say here and no more? And I think that's something that I write a lot, and I write a lot about, like understanding, okay, this character's willing to, do something dishonest or bad, like they have their moral, gray area. But where does that end? At a certain point, like people might not, I'm not perfect, you're not perfect, nobody is, but I definitely have a line for myself where like I, here and no further, like I'm not going to behave a certain way. But but again, like that's something that if you can draw that line in the sand, and again, around whatever is, valuable to your story, whatever, if it's integrity and honesty in the workplace, or if you're writing about, cops and this and that, or killers, there's a whole different, setting there, war and how soldiers have to deal with like having to kill someone else. Like, is that something they're willing to do or comfortable with, whatever you call it? That's where do they draw the line in the sand really helps you understand who they are. And then more likely than not, if you do draw that line in the sand, if you do that early enough in the story, you're kind of hinting at the rest of the tale, which is that they're going to get to that point where they have to make that decision. And so I think that's something it can be very, again, powerfully done, I think, if handled correctly. But on that note, and I think it's something it's important to kind of consider, is like this idea of drawing the line in the sand, what your person or what your character believes, is one thing. And it might be, you might think that's important. It's like, it's not about what they look like. It's not even necessarily about, just because they think something, just giving them thoughts and then they don't act upon them. It's like, no, action is who they are. Action is character. And I always think of that line, or that phrase, action is character. It actually comes from, or at least I know it from F. Scott Fitzgerald, who had written it. It was like above his desk. It was like he just written it down and put it there above his desk when he wrote when he was working on his final novel. Action is character. He understood it's like when what people do really is what they are or who they are. And I think that's something I get lost in that a lot in my stories, where I'm like trying to develop like what they think about things, but oftentimes they're just passive participants in, events. They're just watching it, and I'm trying to develop them because, they don't like it, but they weren't doing anything with it. Like, you have to have your characters be doing something, making an action, and then after that, then you get motivation. Action and motivation will get to that heart of your character, but it has to be action first. I mean, that's the more important, that's the more powerful indicator of who and what they are. It shows you when they're truly brave, and it gives you that moment to show their bravery or cowardice or whatever they do. Like that gives you that moment. And again, it's not what they wish they'd done, it's what they do. So if they didn't do it, do the right thing, that's who they are. Even if they knew it was, if they wanted to do it or this or that, whatever, if whatever they did defines them. And so that's a really potent part of it. And then from there, I think, throughout a lot of the bulk of your story, I mean, the action may not be constant. There may be a big action at the beginning and then more decisions. I mean, you want to have it be action oriented, I think, actions and decisions and such throughout your story. But, throughout, as you write and you start kind of building upon your world and showing characters, like who showing readers who your characters really are, I think that's, that's where you get that motivation. But you have to see them act and go, oh, wow, why'd they do that? And once you know why they do that, then you start leading to the next choice. If the reason they made that first decision, whatever it was, maybe it's a good or a bad decision, they'll start to connect. And that's where you kind of like, you really sink your hooks into the readers and they're just totally connected with you. And by the end, it's like, oh, you know how that feels, or you know how they feel. You know what maybe you wish you would do in a similar situation. And maybe you haven't done it. Maybe you failed to do it, but you see them in that situation or somewhat, that aligns with your own experience, and you're able to, start rooting for them or start feeling pity or sympathy or anger toward them. Like, that can be very useful. But again, that's the motivation that comes. I mean, again, and when I say after, I mean, it's secondary in importance. You might place it, earlier in the story if you really want to. That's one thing, but you want to have the action be, or I would say it's good to consider the action is far more prominent and important to the character and to how people will think of your character than the underlying motivation. Another thing I wanted to talk about, again, I've kind of gone through it throughout this little talk here, but the importance of character introductions. Characters are truly the heart of your book. People will come back to your novel over and over again, not because of the plot. You might be a great writer and they might, do a great job writing, setting and descriptions, but ultimately people, I think, truly fall in love with novels or, stories because of the characters. Very few examples, I would argue, outside of that really exist. I mean, there are some, but if people are if you want them to like your character, if you want them to root for them, if you want to, hurt with them or hate them, all that, it starts in that introduction. Maybe you're setting up one expectation and they do the wrong thing. You think they're going to, and, ultimately you don't want people to like your character. But you're trying to, figure out why do people do some of these bad things, or why do they make a bad decision here, there, whatever. I think that type of character exploration and development is that's the heart of a lot of great writing. I mean, almost all great writing. So, you really have to think about how important it is to start it off right on the right foot. Just like when you meet a new person in real life, in person, you got to say like, oh, your first impressions, they have that huge impact on how they, they'll decide in the first 20 or 30 seconds what they think of you, and that's hard to change. Like, you can change it, but it's a little tricky. I think that's very much so what we're seeing here. It's very much so with the character introduction. Same thing as being introduced to a person. Get people to be, at the very least, interested. They don't have to like them, but they either have to like them, hate them, something. They just can't be neutral. Along with that, I think character planning is super, this is so important that, while some writers, Stephen King's a great example. I know I've read about Anne Rice doing similar, where there may be a fair bit of research beforehand, a lot of notes on, settings and this and that, but more often than not, they write kind of by the seat of their pants. They just, they kind of figure out who their characters are, put them in a scenario, a setting, whatever, or a scenario, and then they just let it play out. And they're as surprised as anybody else, by the end of the book. Like, they figure out some way out. And then they'll go through and they rewrite and they fix it, and they're great at editing themselves, I'm sure, but there's a degree of, like, when they're writing that they don't really know what's going to happen. They don't even necessarily know their character will survive the story or whatever else, but they have kind of some vague notion of where they'll go, but they just go. They just start writing, they figure out who they are, and they try to figure out great situations to challenge whoever they figure out their character is, and then see if they'll make a different decision, and just let the words flow. And I think that's great. I think that's a beautiful thing when writers can do it, but for me, and for, I know, a lot of different writers, most people, especially if you're writing a longer story, it helps immensely to plan and to create an outline and figure out, meticulously or somewhat meticulously, like who your character is and who they are at the beginning, who they kind of evolve into maybe toward the middle, or where they start having a lot of conflict and they have to make, a decision. And then, either the climax is that making that decision, or, making that and then kind of seeing the fallout of who they become because of that decision. They start to evolve into a different person who has different responsibilities, or more or less, or better or worse, whatever it is. There's a lot of advantages to that, and being able to write with a plan, it's just helpful for most people. So I do strongly recommend that, in planning when they come into the story, and how does that balance off with other characters? Because maybe that gives you a good idea, like, oh, that character's a good guy and this other one's a jerk. You can do that. You can kind of play with that if you really know how you're introducing your characters. And it gives you a lot of opportunity to foreshadow later on. So if your character is going to go from being, really selfish to doing a very selfless thing toward the end, you can lean into how they are at the beginning. I think Pixar does such a great job of that. I mean, you start a movie like Up, and a few minutes in, you're totally invested in, the older guy, and you feel his kind of sadness, his loneliness, everything else, and that's not his. I mean, that's the starting point. That's where he is. The end of the story is him being happier and having a more fulfilled life, and more, getting out there and having his adventures again without, even though his wife is gone. That's an evolution for him. But at the beginning, he's just an unhappy old guy, and that's, in a way they foreshadow the end by just showing you so effectively where the character, starts the story. So I did want to give an example, and again, this is where I'm at in my, I'm working on this next novel, and I figured, like, why not just do a podcast or a little video on this and give some of my ideas, because I've been working on this chapter a little bit a little bit excessively, like trying to restructure like kind of 2 chapters into one before. But I want to introduce this character, Charlie. He's a supporting character to Ed, my kind of point of view character. And in the story throughout this book, it's going to be called, or at least tentatively called, Room for Shadows. Ed is kind of my main character. He's a private detective, and it essentially is him like kind of hunting down a killer. Won't give it all away, but the first chapter is a lot of overall world building, and then kind of introducing Ed, and he's not really the best of guys. He's kind of a jerk. And then he has this buddy, Charlie, who he met years and years before. They were both in the Army, and they were in almost like exactly the opposite position of one another. They were in like total mirror opposites, and they're supposed to kind of be that way. And so I jokingly call this chapter A Tale of Two Charlies, because in the present day where we start the story, Ed is in a interrogation room in the police department. He's getting interrogated by this detective who doesn't like him, and it's kind of a very tense moment, let's say. And Charlie comes in. Charlie enters at that point, and that's the first introduction of Charlie, and he's a detective, and he kind of gets Ed out of trouble. Well, that's, and Ed ends up getting, asking to do some work for the police department and all this stuff, and you kind of learn more about the overall tale. But, toward the end of that kind of main part of the story, I transition to a memory into the past. And the past story is when they first met back in the Army, and that is almost the exact opposite of what's happening in the present day with them, where Ed was the one, or Charlie was the one in trouble, and Ed was the one who came in and was tasked by his commanding officer to, help out and look out for Charlie and keep him in line. And Charlie and Ed kind of coming along and, somewhat reluctantly, like Ed's kind of the good guy, and he was once upon a time the more on the more straight and narrow path. And now, 20, 30 years later, as kind of middle-aged guys, they're very much so in the in the opposite flipped position. So like that, to me, like that's how I'm structuring this particular chapter. Like each chapter has like a sort of a memory part where it gives context and kind of helps you understand why Ed's making certain decisions. But I also want to develop characters like Charlie who have to make decisions throughout the novel as well. So this is one example for me where I'm doing something pretty complicated. Again, I'm having 2 introductions in the same chapter, and one of them is introduction of Charlie to the reader, and then a few minutes later, or a few pages later, it's the introduction of Ed and Charlie, like their first introduction, their first meeting. So you get to see these characters kind of introduced to one another, or coming into contact with one another in almost the same type of situation but flipped, and how that like what happened between those 2 moments where one guy kind of went bad and the other one turned things around. So definitely really excited, and I think I'm just going to keep giving examples from some of my work as I do more of these short videos on character development and setting the tone in a story, and just everything and anything and everything for writing, and trying to kind of show people what my process is like. And I did want to just give a few quick tips, at least from my perspective, on good character introductions. First, I say go easy on physical descriptions. I don't really, unless there's something that's really important, like, oh, he had this scar, or he's discriminated against, or, this or that. Like, if that's part of the story and the character, like that certainly is, something to be brought up. But more often than not, what they look like is not who they are. So that's not really something, other than maybe just, giving an idea of like what they're dressed like, or, very briefly, so people can kind of orient themselves within the story, then move right on. Second, include conflict right off the bat. They have to want something. Kurt Vonnegut is one of the great writers of all time and great writing teachers, and he said, every story, no matter what, you have to have your characters want something. Maybe they just want a cup of coffee, but they've got to want something so that, you have a reason to be looking at them. They're not just sitting there. So there has to be desire. So include some conflict, some desire, and maybe some obstacle to it right off the bat, so you can see how your character responds in a particular situation. And really very much so with that, start with action. I think, start with a decision, or start with something they're doing, and let us know more about them later. I think that's more intriguing. I think it's a more, interesting way to introduce your characters, but also it keeps you from trying to explain who they are right off the bat. And again, it's more showing us who they are than telling. And I don't really like that show don't tell type of phrasing. I heard it a lot in school. Lots of teachers would say that to the class, like, oh, show don't tell. And I get what they mean, and they're not wrong, but they're like, it's more valuable. It's like, yes, you want to show and tell and explain everything you can and the best that you can, the clearest you can, but try to show it through action and through actual events rather than just your context, maybe tips or your contextual explanation of a situation. Like, actually just show them do something that impact, and then that's who they are, and that's why, maybe, or that's gives you a lot of clues about who they are and why. Finally, I wanted to just, for anybody out there who wants to work on their own character introductions as they start developing characters in short stories, novels, plays, movies, whatever, few exercises you can try out at home. So first and foremost, try to introduce a character without any physical description. Just let us know exactly who they are. Show us that perfectly, and we have no idea what they look like. Second, introduce a character with only dialogue. Hemingway was great about doing that, where he'd just have pages where it looked like it was nothing but, it'd just be quotes. They wouldn't even necessarily say he said, she said. You had to kind of know based on the way the conversation's going. It's great for plays, but if you're writing a novel or a short story, go ahead. Just use dialogue. Just use what they say. And again, words can be actions too. They can say hurtful things or caring things, and that's an action. So try to utilize that with with only dialogue, not describing what they look like or what movements they make, just the things they say. Third, try introducing a character without any dialogue. Do the flip. Just do the exact opposite. No dialogue whatsoever, just somebody moving around within a scene, doing things physically, listening, and somehow responding without necessarily having any without having any spoken word whatsoever. Maybe they're alone, and maybe they're just doing something around their house, or they're out camping or whatever it is, just without any dialogue whatsoever. Introduce a character and see if people would know what kind of decisions they'll make, even though they've never heard them say a word. Fourth is one that's very popular, or one that's pretty well known, which is in media res. It's more of a way of starting a story rather than introducing a character, but it just means in the middle of the action. I know George Lucas liked to talk about it. He did it with Star Wars, where everything was already going on, the Empire and all this stuff. Like, he had like a 9-part story, and we started with story 4. So a great way you can do this, I was thinking about it, was just, and I've done this a little bit myself, where I just can't quite figure out how to introduce that character. I'll write a short story that's meant to be before the start of my actual novel or longer story, and I just write it all out. I get all that stuff I want to say out of there and just like define it as if it's part of the book. And then I just take it out and let them start. Once I've gotten that out of the way, then I let the real action begin. And more often than not, by cutting out a lot of this, like me trying to, through exposition or whatever it is, describe them and get you to understand them, if I take that part out, put you right in the middle of the action, and that you start seeing them do things, you get a better idea of who they are quicker, and it's way more interesting and exciting and all that. So I think it's a great way to practice, and just write a story and cut off maybe the first 10%, see what happens. And then last one, I will give a one opportunity to just use physical description. I don't love to do that. I don't like to overly describe, again, either the way they look or their clothing, but if you have something that's particularly telling, there's something maybe important to them, or that could really illustrate a lot about their character, I think that is a great way to do it. And some amazing writers have done that through purely a physical description that helps you understand who the character is. And, just seeing how, I don't know, meticulously they maintain it or whatever it is, they're able to take one, trait, physical trait, piece of clothing, thing they carry, whatever it is, and they're able to describe and define them very, very well by that. And I think that's something you can do too. Like, describe your gangster just by his gun. What's that gun? Why is it special? What's he do? Is it clean? Is it dirty? Just describe the gun, and then see if we could actually know, just based on the gun, or the whatever he uses, like what's that gangster's choice is going to be made? What's he going to do? If somebody's just describe that. Describe a hockey player's stick, just the stick. What does he do does he wrap it? Are they always breaking? What does it tell you about that character? Like that, Take one thing and try to tell us who your character is and give us an idea of like how is this person going to react to whatever scenarios unfold throughout your story. All right, well, thank you everybody for listening to this somewhat short little video on character introductions and improving your own characters. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave a comment below and check out the Hear It app with my first novel, Auto Clarity, as well as a short story and even a song that I wrote. It's available on iOS and Android now. Thank you.